as long as it was up to me, I was never going to settle this lawsuit. I had been willing, up until this point, to walk away from the whole thing, to settle this whole thing for a public apology, a third-party, independent investigation. I wanted engagement that demonstrated understanding and changed behavior. And I was willing to settle this lawsuit for those things.
Welcome to Perverted Justice. This is not just a story. It's a call to action for integrity and radical honesty, in spite of personal cost. Now here's your host, Shielagh Clark.
Welcome back. This is episode 19. This episode will conclude our time camping out in the summer of 2022. So I am going to take a few minutes to tie up some loose ends before I finish this episode. But to begin, in the last episode, I mentioned Jim calling the police on me and then Mike Green calling to apologize the next day. But I failed to mention that after Mike read my letter in the board meeting and got some kind of clarity, I guess, from Jim about an assumption he made about those photographs, the whole Green family called me on speakerphone and they invited me to come to their church so that they could listen to what I had to say. They really wanted things to be made right, and they hoped that Jim hearing me out might lead to him giving me an apology or offering me an apology. And while I desperately wanted to be heard, I was apprehensive about putting myself in such a vulnerable position again, especially with no indication that Jim was even remotely remorseful. And because there were ties between that church and Hyde Park Baptist Church, I was nervous about how my words might end up being used as weapons, legally. So I told them that I was going to need to think about it. And I really wanted to go, and I was just really afraid to go. And this fear was only compounded at the next court conference, which I mentioned in the last episode. I told you that the church's attorney told the court clerk that I had come to the church and confronted his client, and then the next day the police had to be called on me. What I didn't tell you is that my attorney called a meeting with me and proceeded to scold me like I was a child. As soon as he got on to the call, he said, "When I heard what you did, I was pissed." Pissed. Now, he didn't find out about it in the court conference. I think I mentioned in the last episode that I told them what I did. And then they asked me to write up a summary of what happened during my trip north. And I didn't realize at the time that speaking to the church was technically a violation of my retainer agreement. If I had realized that, it may have changed my actions. But like I've said already, I don't regret going. I don't regret having the conversation with them. I felt 7,000 pounds lighter afterward, as I've already said, because I knew that I had met my own moral standard. I had done everything humanly possible to communicate clearly what it is that I needed from them, what I wanted from this process, what my goals were. I clearly communicated the hurt that I'd experienced, and the ball was firmly in their court. There was no doubt about that in my being anymore. So I fully expected that there would be a consequence for that. Maybe some kind of a fine, or maybe they would drop my case. And I showed up to this meeting prepared to hear what I'd done wrong and what the consequence was. And it would have been 100% lousy if they had dropped my case. But I am a logical human and I understand that actions have consequences. What I was not expecting when I showed up for this meeting was to be scolded like a child. So he basically said that it was so embarrassing for them to have to sit in this court conference and listen to the church's attorney tell the court what I did. And I asked very calmly, what did they say I did? And then that's when my attorney said that you came to the church property and you confronted his client, and the next day the police had to be called on you. And so I asked if he could define confront in the context that it was being used, because I definitely didn't confront the church. Alex asked to talk to me. I did show up. I showed my face, but I didn't cause a scene. I didn't confront anyone. My attorney's response to that was just to kind of like snap at me and say, just going there is a confrontation, in my opinion, or quite frankly, something like that. And then he started going on about how, I put the whole case in jeopardy, and my damages are already harder to prove because compared to some of his other clients, I appear to have my life together. And remember back when he was setting the amount, the demand amount for this case, I mentioned that my life appears to be put together. I'm not addicted to drugs, right? I've been married one time and for a long time. And he's the one who told me that that doesn't matter because even his clients who are addicted to drugs and have all of these problems, clearly from their abuse, the other side will argue that it's caused by something else, right? And now, when he's mad at me for speaking to the church, he's flipping the script. He said, how can you go there and confront them when you've been so damaged or so harmed by them in the past? Which, for the record, is completely ignoring the healing power of confrontation. When you confront something that scares you, you get stronger. When you face your fears, you grow. He knows this. Anyway, he kept pushing and pushing and pushing until I cried. And I cried a lot. And, I said things like, you have no idea what it is like to be held to a higher moral standard than literally anyone else. It doesn't matter what I do, I'm doing the wrong thing. And everybody else, they make excuses for everyone else. Well, she did this and she did that, so of course the pastor can't live a moral life, right? But I have to walk a tightrope. Anyway, he pushed me till I cried, and then he said, I don't think you'd be any worse off emotionally if you hadn't gone. Trying to completely undermine the emotional benefit, the settling of my conscience. And he has no right to try to gauge the emotional value of any decision that I make. And I was just, I don't know, I couldn't believe that my own attorney was trying to force me to adopt the narrative of the people who are harming me, instead of just letting me know what happened, explaining the rule, maybe imposing some kind of a consequence, and then having a plan for what it is that we need to do to counteract or what we're going to do to spin it in our favor. And I think it's worth noting that when we were approaching trial, this issue came up again, and suddenly it was fine because it just proves how much this had harmed me and how hard I was working to try to advocate for myself and to make repairs. It was no big deal that I had gone to the church property. This is for other survivors who may decide to file a lawsuit. I spoke to some other survivors who had a very different relationship with their attorneys. And, they would say things to me like, you just need to tell them this is the way it is. This is what you want. This is how you want it to go. And I was never able to muster that in myself to just say, listen, I'm paying you. And there was this weird upside down dynamic in my relationship with particularly my male attorney, where it really felt a lot like a repeat of the dynamics of my abuse. And I want to say that carefully. I'm not trying to make an accusation, but now here is another man with specialized knowledge, this time not about the Bible so much, although that was kind of an element, but about the law. And I just have to trust him and trust this process. And whenever I do something to advocate for myself, I get scolded. I wanted to bring attention to that for other people who decide to go through this process, that it's really important that you don't let yourself be stuck in that dynamic again, because you don't need someone to come in and save you. That doesn't help you heal. At least it didn't help me heal. You need to learn how to stand up for yourself. And I kept feeling annoying and like it wasn't okay for me to ask questions. And so I would research everything I could and try to understand the process ahead of time so that I could reduce the number of questions that I had. And my questions still seemed to bother my attorney. In fact, one of them said to me one time, you hired attorneys to litigate your case. Let us litigate your case. And I couldn't just do nothing. I needed to understand every step of the process, mostly because I needed to make sure that what was happening on my behalf was in accordance with the truth and with my morals. I didn't want someone acting for me. I didn't want something wrong being done on my behalf. I needed to be in charge in this process. I felt like I was handcuffed and blindfolded. Anyway, so I got off the call with the attorneys and I immediately called Tom Slaughter because I felt like I was losing my grip on reality and I was so upset. I mean, not just by the way that the attorneys were treating me, but just the fact the church had decided to weaponize this conversation that I was still holding out hope was going to change things. It was going to produce healing and reconciliation and a new way forward. I was just telling Tom that I just couldn't believe it, that they would do this. And I wept into the phone trying to explain what I was feeling about it. And Tom finally said, "You're not surprised, though, are you?" And he was right. I was not surprised. This was completely consistent with everything that had happened right along. What I really was devastated. I was just completely devastated that all of that effort, bearing my soul, had made no difference. That I had zero effect on the course forward. So Tom prayed with me and I got off the phone and I realized after that I definitely could not go and talk to Resurrection Bible Church. I had to decline the invitation to come speak to them. I think it was after this call that I decided that as long as I had the power to decide, as long as it was up to me, I was never going to settle this lawsuit. I had been willing, up until this point, to walk away from the whole thing, to settle this whole thing for a public apology, a third-party independent investigation. I wanted engagement that demonstrated understanding and changed behavior. And I was willing to settle this lawsuit for those things. And I realized after that court conference that the church had no intention of learning anything, of responding in any way to me. There was no humanity, no care, no concern. This was a purely business, monetary, legal response. That's all it was. There was no space for me in that equation. Zero. So I decided I was going to take it all the way to the courtroom, and I was going to tell the truth from the stand. And a few weeks later, I think it was a few weeks later, Tom Slaughter texted me, and he said, "Is it okay if I give Alex your phone number?" So immediately, I'm thinking, what? I was wrong? They want to communicate with me? I was excited that Alex had reached out to Tom, and we were going to continue this conversation. And I knew that I was going to get in trouble for it by my attorneys. I had promised them that I wouldn't talk to the church again without informing them first or getting permission from them first. So I responded to Tom, asking if he could maybe find out from Alex what it was that he wanted, like the gist of what it was he wanted to communicate, so that then I could determine how I could communicate this to the attorneys. Maybe we should have a mediation, whatever. And then Tom explained that no, Alex thanked Tom for staying for that meeting with Shielagh. And Tom's response to that was, "Have you followed up with her like you promised you would?" And Alex said, "I don't have her number." So I guess Tom wanted to find out if it would be okay to give Alex the number so that then he wouldn't have an excuse to not reach out to me and then see what happened from there. And so I misunderstood, and I thought, oh, we're actually making progress. And so that was disappointing all over again. It's not Tom's fault. It just further highlights how dishonest they were being. So anyway, several episodes ago, I read the letter that I wrote to my attorneys when they canceled the church's deposition. And I didn't actually tell you what their response to that was. But basically, they responded by agreeing to do the church's deposition, mostly because settlement negotiations had stalled, and that I could choose 3 people who I wanted to be deposed in addition to the church's deposition. So the church chose Alex Valentine as their representative, so he was deposed on behalf of the church, which is insanity to me. Alex was at the church back then, but he wasn't on the board until after my abuse was exposed. But Dale Blue was on the board for years beforehand and since. And he's still there, and clearly he was the person who was most suited to answering those questions. But they chose Alex. Alex was the representative. He was deposed, I think, on September 2nd of 2022. And then the 3 people that I chose were Mike Green, Pete Nargi, and Marilyn Bradford. And Diane had been deposed earlier in the process, so we had a total of 5. It was Diane, Alex Valentine, Mike Green, Pete Nargi, and Marilyn Bradford. Pete Nargi brought documents to his deposition, some of which we already had, and some of which were brand new. And the brand new ones were a series of emails between Lori Nargi and Jonathan Weaver's counselor, Charles McLean, at the Calvary Baptist Theological Seminary, where Weaver went when he left Hyde Park, New York. And I think that Pete thought that by bringing these documents, he was going to blow up my whole case. Like he was going to present information to the court or to my attorneys that I had kept hidden or something, which of course was not the case. I told this entire story, except that I didn't have any proof. I had no proof outside of one email between myself and Charles McLean that any of this had happened. And Pete Nargi walked in with all of the proof. All of it. He handed it right to us. And I posted privately to myself only on Facebook that day that I was thankful that things persist over time, that the truth persists even when people try to hide it or to reframe it. The truth persists. I didn't even know these documents existed. I never could have imagined that they would hold on to them for this long. And I'm going to go over those emails in season 2 when I discuss the abuse. But I wanted to highlight here that this is where I got them from. So after I officially declined the invitation from Resurrection Bible Church, I did receive a letter in the mail from Jim Mitchell. I think the church had encouraged him to apologize to me, and he wrote me a letter that I'm not going to read here, but it wasn't an apology. And I typed up a response to him and ultimately decided not to send it because it really just wasn't worth the effort or the energy or the emotional toll that it would take to engage with him further. He couldn't muster the words, "I'm sorry." I don't want to get too deep into the details of that. It's really just not important. I have to tell another story that happened in this time frame. In early November of 2022, another abuse survivor went to the Hyde Park Baptist Church to confront them. She was unaware of what was going on with me and my lawsuit. She didn't know me. And she went to have a conversation with the current pastor about her own victimization that involved the Hyde Park Baptist Church. But I have the police report here, and Matthew Cale called the police to have a victim removed from the church parking lot. And what did I tell you? That I am not an anomaly. And the church would treat any victim the same way that they're treating me. It's not something that I did. The church is set up to respond to victims the way that they are treating me. And another victim, in fact, came forward, attempted to have a conversation with the new pastor to find closure and healing, and was met with law enforcement being called on her. I didn't find out about any of that until after my lawsuit was already settled, and this person found out about me, found me online, and contacted me, and actually sent me this recording of her interaction with Murray. And I have changed her voice so that she's unidentifiable. But I want you to hear Murray interact with her. I want you to hear it with your own ears.
Aren't you also at this church? No, I am. I'm talking. I didn't want to talk to you. No. even though God sent you?
Can't because you guys have a lawsuit against
Who?
him. Drop the lawsuit.
What lawsuit?
Drop the lawsuit and look up. That news right now.
Anyway, it's absurd because he knew that she was not me. He knew who I was. And he knew that this person was not me. So this is the MO. This is the standard operating procedure of many churches. They would rather run from the truth than open the doors and welcome the scrutiny so that they can learn and change, and no more children have to become victims of their insufficiency. Self-protection at its finest, and all the damage that comes along with it. So New York State passed the Adult Survivors Act earlier in 2022, and it went into effect. The window officially opened in November of 2022. And we filed a second lawsuit against the church at that time because obviously the Adult Survivors Act covers the things that CVA could not cover. So it includes the beginning of the abuse, that's all covered in CVA, and then it was able to cover some of the stuff that happened from 18 to 20. And it even was able to cover some of the things that happened in the aftermath of the exposure of my abuse. It gets a little bit complicated there because once Weaver was no longer an employee of the church, their responsibility for his behavior ends. So that gets a little bit complicated, but we were able to put in some of the horrible things that happened in the aftermath. The big difference between the Child Victims Act and the Adult Survivors Act is that a child can't consent. It's not legally possible. And so consent wasn't an issue in the CVA case. And so in the Adult Survivors Act, I have to prove that I did not consent to the sexual contact that was had between myself and Weaver, and then still point back to the negligence of Hyde Park Baptist Church and its leaders when it came to protecting me. And the causes of action are slightly different. The CVA case claimed intentional infliction of emotional distress, and the Adult Survivors Act claims negligence, recklessness, and failure to exercise a reasonable standard of care. Like I said, this was filed, I think we finally filed it in January of 2023, hit the newspaper shortly after that. Thankfully, it didn't have the kind of reaction the first one had, but the Nargis did take to Facebook to post an imprecatory psalm. Thankfully, this time, they only posted one, I think, instead of a full 30 days of them, and the church's legal response to the filing of the second lawsuit was to file a motion to dismiss, and that didn't stand either. The judge just knocked that down. It was combined with the CVA case into one. The one case number was sort of absorbed into the original case number, and they were treated as one unit going forward. And now, thanks to the Adult Survivors Act, we had one cohesive whole that would go to trial altogether. So I think that's probably a good stopping point. If I have to guess, I think we probably have only maybe 3 episodes left before season 1 is done. And then I'm going to go back to the beginning and walk through the abuse in season 2. If you made it this far, thanks for listening.
If your community is dedicated to fostering a safe and supportive environment, connect with Grace, Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment, at netgrace.org. Grace's mission is to empower Christian communities to recognize, prevent, and respond to abuse effectively. They provide vital resources and training to help churches understand the complexities of abuse and adopt effective prevention policy and trauma-informed responses.